Welcome, everyone. This is, I think we call it now the community presentation. We used to call it the Columbia presentation, but it's to the community at Columbia University. These are the capstone short presentations from the undergraduate Sustainable Development Workshop. We have two sections running for that capstone. I run one of the sections, and Radley Horton, who maybe here runs the other section. And generally we have two teams each. In this case, we have only three altogether. I'll explain in a second. But anyway, these are the short 10-minute presentations, so they're fairly short. The groups will be giving a more detailed technical presentation to their respective clients this week, probably in most cases, if they haven't already, and possibly. The clients do not come to this presentation. This is just for the Columbia audience. We do this because we know there's a lot of interest in seeing the Sustainable Development Program and how the students have progressed and what they've learned, which is always quite impressive. I do want to thank a few people. Hold on a second before we get started. I want to thank Carrie Shimkus, who is the administrator for the program, who makes it all run. Does a lot of behind-the-scenes work and a lot of logistics planning. I also want to thank our two wonderful teaching assistants, Sophia Robel, who worked with Radley Horton's group this semester, and Colette Eustace, who worked with my group this semester. So, and I always like to thank Natalie Unwin-Coroneri, who began this program in many ways and still administers it in many ways as well. So without further ado, what we're going to do is they're going to come up each team, give you their short, strict 10 minutes or less presentation. Then we've reserved 5 minutes for questions. We'll pass around a microphone. What we would like to ask, a couple of things. The speakers for each team might only be one or two, but during the Q&A afterwards, if the rest of the team could come up and join them, just stand alongside, that would be good. I was also told that when you speak, everyone speak into the microphone because it's being recorded. And when you're answering questions, if you're standing here, just pass the microphone to each other so that the questions get answered and recorded properly. The only other small thing I'd like to ask is that each team, after you're finished, please, if you don't have a conflict and have to leave because of a conflict, don't leave. Please stay here and listen out of respect for the other teams, because we want an audience, we want questions. So if you could stay, if you don't have a conflict, we would appreciate that. So we're going to get started. The first team is the transportation team, but the full title is Commute and Fleet Emissions Data Analysis for Columbia University. So.
Hi, everyone. This is my team. For the semester, we have been working with the Columbia Transportation Department and the Office of Environmental Stewardship. And just for a quick background, this project is divided into two parts. Part one being an analysis of the 2016 Columbia Transportation Survey. So that was a survey sent out last year to the Columbia community, students, faculty, and staff, trying to get information about their commuting patterns and habits. And that was done by the Office of Environmental Stewardship. And then the second part is talking about Columbia owned and operated fleet vehicles. Both of these, transportation, in case you don't know, in the Columbia Sustainability Plan, which was launched in April of this year, is a big area of focus in terms of reducing emissions from transportations associated with the university. So with that, I'll let them take it away.
So for part one, our objective was to create a tool to use in future surveys to analyze the data and also make a couple recommendations on a number of fronts. So first, to understand why commuting is even important to sustainability, it's mainly important because, number one, a lot of people commute, and number two, the commute produces emissions. So here are a couple numbers kind of illustrating that. 45% of Americans over 16 years old commute. 23% of the world's emissions come from transportation. This isn't all from commuting, but again, it it kind of puts the whole project into perspective. And then down below, these are a couple New York City specific statistics. The average one-way commute is 34.9 minutes, and almost 450,000 people commute to New York City every day from out of state, and these are both the highest numbers in the country. And then in terms of emissions, 6.17 billion estimated pounds of CO2 are emitted per year in New York City due to commuting, and this ends up being about 5.18% of New York City's total emissions. And later we'll go into how Columbia kind of fits into this, this picture. A little bit more about the survey background. It was first conducted in 2013, and the second one, the one we are working with, is from 2016, and it's issued by the Office of Environmental Stewardship, and its purpose, as you can see, is to inform future planning and how best meet the dynamic transportation needs of our students, faculty, and staff in an effective and environmentally friendly way. And this response rate was 19%, which through research and other means, we kind of found out that this was in line with similar surveys.
So I'm not going to get too in-depth on the methods. If you have any questions, you can, of course, ask afterward. But the main way that we used the survey data to calculate emissions was to first separate it by commute mode and then calculate the total miles driven per commute mode, looking at the miles between the home zip code listed and the person's primary campus, then multiplying that by the days per week on campus and the weeks per year. Then doing that, we were able to extrapolate out to total miles for the Columbia community, as well as total emissions in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent for each mode, and then adding these up to get a total estimate for the Columbia community. In doing this, we had to make quite a few assumptions, which again, I'm not going to get into, but one that I will talk about because I thought it might be interesting for this audience is looking a little bit deeper into the response rate, which, as Zach said, was 19%, but this was actually split between 22% for employees and 13% for students. And as you can see, the commute modes for these two groups are quite different, with students walking to campus a lot more, driving and taking the subway a lot less. So because of this difference, it could have led to an overestimation in our numbers, which we felt was much better than an underestimation.
And using our Excel tool, we were able to estimate that Columbia commuters traveled an estimated 125,280,492 miles in 2016. The commute mode that accounted for the most miles traveled was the MTA subway, with over 32 million miles traveled on it, followed by driving alone with 29 million miles, and then coming in third was New Jersey Transit with 18 million miles traveled. And then once we were able to estimate the individual overall miles traveled for each commute mode, we then inputted that into our emissions calculator tool and got a total of 25,117 metric tons of carbon equivalent emitted by Columbia commuters in 2016. The commute mode that accounted for the majority, or the most metric tons emitted, was driving alone with 7,183 metric tons emitted, followed by the MTA subway with over 3,000, and then the New Jersey Transit was also around 3,300. Columbia's location in New York City is unique, and it provides its affiliates with a wide variety of carbon-efficient commute modes versus if we were a rural university, whereas if you don't live within walking or biking distance of campus, you're going to have to drive alone, which isn't very carbon-efficient. And just kind of highlight the difference that has on the commuting carbon footprint. This graph compares the miles traveled on the MTA subway and driving alone and the emissions of those same commute modes. And as you can see, the miles traveled by each of these commute modes was pretty similar, with around 32 million miles traveled and 29 million miles traveled. However, driving alone accounted for over 2 times as many emissions, emitting over 7,000, whereas the subway only emitted 3,000. And so since Columbia has access to these efficient commute modes as a university, we really should try to utilize it because it allows us to have an efficient carbon footprint from commuting.
So we did have quite a few survey suggestions to improve for next year, but one of our primary suggestions was to really prove the salience of both the results of this survey and commuting as a whole to the Columbia community. So to that end, we developed this as a draft of an infographic that the Transportation Department or Office of Environmental Stewardship could disseminate to the Columbia community, and we just wanted to share that with you today. Basically just putting into context both the miles driven by the Columbia community and the CO2 equivalent. The same amount of CO2 would be emitted by over 2,000 homes, their energy use for a year. As we talked about, the most common commute modes, and then of course the differences in efficiency between those, with the subway being at least half as efficient as driving alone, and walking, of course, being the most carbon efficient commute mode possible.
So we did the second part of the project, which was focused more on fleet vehicles rather than commuting. So just for a brief background, we were basically just supposed to use this Columbia's fleet inventory data to determine historic and current fleet emissions, and then through that recommend fleet options for 2027 and propose policies that Columbia can use to lead them towards buying the most efficient vehicles.
And to give a quick overview of the results of what we found that emissions were increased actually by approximately 120,000 pounds of carbon dioxide over the last 10 years. And this is largely due to increased shuttle mileage. So in the context of exactly how much Columbia has increased the mileage of the shuttles, which are really carbon inefficient, and it's added more vehicles and longer routes, actually 120,000 is pretty impressive as a net impact, because it should have been much higher, but the addition of electric vehicles and other efficiency measures actually kept that number from rising far above that. As I mentioned, shuttles are very inefficient, and transportation shuttles currently account for about 22% of the miles driven by the current fleet, so you can see that on the pie chart to the left, and 38% of its emissions, while the Baker shuttles, which run up to Baker Field from Morningside Heights, cause athletics to account for 24% of the miles driven and 35% of emissions. So there's a really disproportionate impact there. And one other thing that we did in addition to calculating the historic and current emissions was also creating a tool for projecting what future emissions may be. So we have an Excel document that's our deliverable for our client, which details exactly how we did each calculation for the current and historic fleet emissions, and also includes a sheet where they can input the details about a vehicle they may be considering acquiring and see exactly how many emissions per year it would add, depending on the route that it runs and its fuel efficiency and other factors. And then a very simplistic tool for calculating projected fleet emissions, where the fuel type and technology column is actually a drop down. So you can just flip between current or 100% election or 100% electric for each department within the fleet, and then see if you, for example, convert all of transportation to electric vehicles, exactly how many emissions could that save. Obviously, there's a lot more. It would be a lot more complicated the more you dive into the calculations, but this is meant to be just a first glance that the Transportation Department can use when they're considering making changes.
So we also were tasked with proposing 2 future fleets for 2027. So one was the most sustainable fleet, and the other one was the most cost-effective yet sustainable fleet. So in terms of the most sustainable fleet, we decided to switch every vehicle over to electric, and that would lead to a 70% reduction compared to current emissions. And for the cost-effective yet sustainable fleet, we used the tool that Christina was just showing to figure out which departments have the most impact on the emissions, and we switched those to electric. So actually there was recently just an announcement that a lot of the shuttles will be switching over to electric already. So that basically covers the intercampus shuttles and Lamont shuttles. So if we also switch over the Fort Lee shuttle, Baker shuttle, and Arbor shuttles, it will lead to a 62% reduction in GHG emissions. And this is a very small fraction of Columbia's total fleet vehicles, but just switching over these few vehicles leads to a huge reduction. And then in terms of recommended policies, just a brief overview. One thing we came up with was determining a fuel efficiency standard for each vehicle class. So for trucks, for sedans, for pickup trucks, having a different fuel efficiency that they must kind of adhere to. Also assigning dollar amounts to negative externalities. So if you're buying a diesel vehicle, you add a certain dollar amount so it seems more expensive than an electric vehicle. Making sure you're purchasing the right size vehicles and estimating emissions through the tool that we showed today in order to figure out how much you'll be adding.
So the question I have relates to the commuting length. Since, according to most of what you're saying, I mean, that's obviously what scales to CO2 emissions. Did you consider any, for example, effect of long-term policy on building or acquiring housing at Columbia so that people don't have to commute from New Jersey as a way of minimizing commuting footprints? For example, I just pick on New Jersey, but so that's partly because you said that was the biggest single commuting population, right, in terms of length.
Yeah, so the New Jersey Transit was one of the biggest. Yeah, the New Jersey Transit was one of the biggest in terms of mileage. But we more focused our policy suggestions on carpooling and riding bicycles as kind of the two easiest fixes to the commute mode. But I think that one of our other recommendations for the survey was to include like more opportunities for the community to give suggestions in the future. So hopefully that will bring about new ideas.
That's it? Okay, well, thank you very much.